There's so much complicity among industries to allow them to do this and to portray themselves in a certain way. And as long as everybody gets rich off of oil and gas, we're never going to have a solution. And as long as they're writing the big checks, people are being forced to keep secrets.
Hi, Libby. How are you?
Hi. Good. How are you?
Doing okay. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, who you work for?
Sure. I'm Libby Lou. I'm the CEO of a nonprofit called Whistleblower Aid.
So what is Whistleblower Aid and how did it come to be? How did it start?
Whistleblower Aid is a nonprofit that is created to provide holistic support for whistleblowers. So people that are motivated by their conscience to bring information out into public discourse or to enforcement agencies or oversight bodies about things that ought to be known. So it's about transparency and accountability.
And when it started, like what was it that got Whistleblower Aid going?
I'm so glad you asked. We were created by our founder, John Tai, who himself was a national security whistleblower in the Obama administration. He's a brilliant man and discovered things that weren't quite right. And so he went about trying to blow the whistle on this important information. He retained a brilliant counsel who actually co-founded our organization, Mark Zaid. And they did his whistleblowing, and it was so difficult, and something that seemed so inaccessible to a normal person that he decided that we have to create something called Whistleblower Aid so that people who have important disclosures that are essential for the resiliency of our democracy, for example, that they would have proper legal representation and be taken care of.
And so you mentioned there that one of the reasons John set up Whistleblower Aid is that those challenges that whistleblowers face. So what are the challenges that whistleblowers face, and what more could be done to protect them? So obviously you're a non-profit, so
The nonprofit aspect is because we wanted to provide our services for free to our clients, and most of the time whistleblowers are highly sought after by very high net worth law firms because there's awards that are built into some of these whistleblowing programs with the agencies. So those people get lots and lots of really expensive support. Everybody else can't afford the legal representation they need to be able to do this without getting sued, without violating a law, without violating an NDA or a confidentiality agreement. So there was a huge gap, and the people that we prioritize, people who are making important social impact disclosures, generally are facing very adverse circumstances, and they're likely going to lose their jobs and probably their careers, if they get blackballed by the agency or the corporation that they're bringing forward.
So you mentioned there that some of the agencies do provide monetary rewards. I know the SEC in particular provides these. Do you think that sort of reward scheme helps or hinders the whistleblowing process? And do you think there could be a similar reward scheme for maybe more social impact whistleblowers?
I think generally speaking, it's a very good thing. And even better, because there is this award system at the SEC, it guarantees that whistleblowers who are represented by these law firms are going to get the very best lawyers in the world, helping them because the lawyer has a stake in the reward, right? So that's a good thing. But also, it's not really relevant to what we do. We're representing clients that are motivated not by a reward, but for social change and their conscience.
Do you think that there could be a similar system that could be put in place for those social impact whistleblowers?
They could, but it's difficult, right? Because the reward systems are based on what the government will recover from the offender, right? Because they've broken the law, and the enforcement agency is going to go after them. So then there's a pool of money that will come back to the government, and so they can make awards based on that. I think it's a lot more difficult if you're not able to recoup monies to the U.S. government.
So I'm going to move a little bit to a specific whistleblower. So you joined us in November at Web Summit for the opening night ceremony with Frances Haugen, the Facebook whistleblower. And so what has the last year kind of been like in terms of the reception that her revelations have received?
I think that Frances's disclosures have had enormous impact, and I think that we're going to see the impact for years to come. Because the reality is that, Facebook was a vault, and, lots of nonprofits and researchers and academics on the outside were showing the causation effect of what was happening on the platform and real life, but there was never any ability to confirm or deny whether these were conscious choices or known harms or things like that, which there are. So I would say that, several policymakers have already given her credit for some of the changes in moving legislation now, because she brought forward so much compelling evidence that helps. And her testimony at the EU on the DSA, the Digital Services Act, and the Digital Marketing Act have actually caused amendments. And that's what we want.
Yeah.
It just, there needs to be an evening of the playing field, and the secrecy is exacerbating the asymmetry of power.
And so do you think that her disclosures really have moved that policy discussion to a point where we might actually get meaningful regulation of big tech, and particularly of the social media platforms?
Well, I hope so. That depends on legislatures and democracies and their appetite to fight for, regulations. Obviously, the counterbalance is how much power the platforms wield and the money they've invested in not just lobbying, but in influencing.
So you mentioned there the power that the platforms wield, and so you're here at Collision to talk in part about a particular case in Australia where Facebook really did wield its power in a quite, I would say, ostentatious way. So could you tell us a bit more about that particular case?
Sure.
What happened, what Facebook did?
So in Australia, the ACCC, which is the governing body of commerce, basically, they did a research report and found that since Facebook arrived in Australia, that the way people use it in the country as basically an avenue to get all the information they need has hurt or damaged news organizations, because Facebook gets the news for free, and then everybody reads the news on Facebook, so that the original media organizations are being injured. So they introduced a law that would force platforms to negotiate use contracts with content creators, news content creators. And Facebook was vehemently opposed to this, and not interested at all in trying to negotiate and work with the legislators on the language. So instead, because this is a country where Facebook is huge, political parties are reliant on Facebook for the distribution of their party platforms. I mean, so much is done on Facebook there. So there's enormous concentration of power on this platform. So Facebook decided that while this law that they were opposed to was making its way through the legislature, that they would shut down Facebook in Australia for 5 days. And for purposes of their objection to this law, they could have taken down, sites that were amplifying content, right? Instead, they shut down more than 17,000 pages, including emergency services, fire and rescue during bushfire season, health services 2 days before the vaccine rollout in Australia. And basically, they were really making the Australian government feel the pain of what it would be like without Facebook there. So it's just so egregious and brazen in so many ways that the company would use its basic power in the country and risk injuring so many people just to get more negotiating leverage with the government. So they did succeed in getting some, little changes in the law that was eventually done. And once the government agreed to make those modifications, they started turning on the sites again. Our client had evidence that all of this was pre-planned. That, when this happened, suicide hotlines were gone, right? There was a lot of public outcry, and Facebook's position was this was inadvertent, it was an accident, they're trying really hard to make it work. But the evidence brought forward really demonstrates how calculated this was and how happy Mark and Cheryl were with the ultimate outcome after what they had done.
So
they were congratulated for executing every step of this plan perfectly in a, I think, precision way, which heavily undercuts their "oops, this was an accident" problem.
So given that what you described just functionally is a company
extorting
a nation state for legislative change. I mean, Sheryl Sandberg has already announced that she is resigning from Facebook, not because of this, but do you think Mark Zuckerberg should go? Should he be sacked?
I don't think it's possible for him to be sacked because the whole corporation is built around the notion that he has unilateral power. So I don't know that there's any way to force him out. Do I think he's doing a good job? I would say that in the last year, we've had a lot of evidence come out that the company makes deliberate choices that harm the public. And that's not acceptable, especially as they work constantly to aggregate their power even more. They're trying to concentrate their power.
So, I mean, given what you said there as well, that Mark, it's essentially a one-man decision-making company, and the company is clearly making decisions that are causing significant harm all across the world. Should he be held legally accountable for what the company is doing, and could he be prosecuted?
In terms of personal criminal liability, it's an open question. I mean, I hope the government of Australia is looking at the evidence that my client brought forward to ponder what kind of litigation or lawsuit they can bring against the company, because there was deliberate harm to people. And I think that needs to be prosecuted.
And I know we're in Canada at the minute. I know the Canadian legislature is currently considering similar legislation to Australia. You'll be speaking with Nathaniel Erskine-Smith, I believe, tomorrow at Collision on Centre Stage. And he's helping draft that legislation. And is there any evidence that Facebook is trying to engage in similar behaviour here in Canada as to what it did in Australia?
I'm not following close enough to know, and you can ask Nathaniel. I mean, they're definitely lobbying behind the scenes. This is not a law that they want. It's been introduced now in the US and in Canada. And this is why it was so urgent for us to make this disclosure, because they may have thought they could get away with it in a country like Australia. They would, I doubt, ever try to do it in the US, which is why they invest in, US English classifiers and all that stuff, because the scrutiny is so much higher. I just don't want it to be something they can do to other countries. And so that's why it was important to make this disclosure known as the Canadians are contemplating this law.
So I want to ask sort of one last thing about some of the cases that you're taking on or looking to take on. I know you spoke today on stage at Collision about some of the climate work that you're doing. So can you tell us a little bit more about the sort of the climate whistleblower work that Whistleblower Aid are doing?
Sure. We decided to launch a vertical in climate because we think it's such an important and existential crisis. And we see that there is basically a network of industries that are all complicit in driving us to this place and in preventing progress should be made. So that's why we prioritized it. It's interesting because it's not just oil and gas companies, right? We're talking about financial institutions that don't evaluate the risks associated with these efforts, or banks that want to fund these projects that are not doing their job. There are auditors that are not pricing out these risks, and there are ad companies that are involved in this greenwashing of the issue, and making ExxonMobil the solution and not the problem. I mean, there are just so many adjacent industries involved in bringing us to the brink that we really need whistleblowers. It's the only way. And in the history of the climate change disaster, there have been some critical whistleblowers that came and were able to drive some of the change. But there's more, because there's so much complicity among industries to allow them to do this and to portray themselves in a certain way. And as long as everybody gets rich off of oil and gas, we're never going to have a solution. And as long as they're writing the big checks, people are being forced to keep secrets.
I'm nearly ready to wrap things up. I just want the last few years, obviously, Whistleblower Aid has taken on a number of clients that have been, shall we say, critical of big tech. Has Whistleblower Aid ever been accused of being anti-big tech or anti-business, or even with national security clients, even potentially unpatriotic?
I think that there are some, there are always going to be critics, right? I mean, obviously, when we represented the Ukraine whistleblower in the first impeachment of President Trump, there was a lot of hate and threats being sent to us. I don't think we're favorites of Silicon Valley, but I would argue that if we want a country to be resilient, we have to be transparent and accountable. And once we lose that, then what hope is there?
Why do you think big tech fears that transparency?
Because of all the harm that they're doing. I mean, in the Facebook case, we got thousands of internal research studies showing that they were very well aware of the negative impact that they were having. This is like, early days in the tobacco industry when they had scientific research showing addiction, right? They want to be free of regulation and intervention, but they don't want to be responsible for making responsible choices that are proportional to the power they wield.
One last question.
Sure.
For the Collision audience, when they walk away from this event, what's the one message or key takeaway that you would want them to have about Whistleblower Aid, the work that you do, and what would you say to the audience here?
I would say listen to your conscience. Do the right thing. You'll be able to look in the mirror, you'll be able to sleep at night, and if you have to take on somebody scary and powerful, please come to us before you do anything. It's much, much harder to protect you once you've done something.
Libby, thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks so much for having me.